Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Serious, stories of creepypasta are great, but does anyone have any good true creepy stories? Episode 4. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either extremely dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007 and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living in my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, as I always did. Following bare precautions, I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite and so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed through earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than the food. Several days passed and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise was much more likely an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out claiming to have a gun but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash whatever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened was the boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail. Being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said aloud, "Hate this, this trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella located off I-5. The only problem was that it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night: the footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sounds. I knew they were close but wasn't sure how close. All I could think was, this is bad, this is so bad. God damn it. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent, lights up the entire thing, and goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them and the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually birds started chirping and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of mrcreeps and spoke with the police and forest service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and forest service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple. This is a story my gran would tell of something that happened to her when she was younger and happened sometime around the mid-60s. First, a little background: the city we live in has a lot of parks, including many of those little fenced-in gardens in the middle of squares. The current name is based on Gaelic for Deer Green Place. Anyway, my gran worked in a theater and after work would get the last bus home at around midnight, then walk a short distance home, past one of these fenced-in communal gardens. Usually the local policeman, this was the days when people knew and were friendly with their local bobby, would meet her off the bus. One night she was on the bus when some unsure guy sat next to her and generally was being unsure, asking her personal questions, etc. She eventually got up and stood by the bus driver. She was a regular on the bus and knew she could get some friendly chat from him to deter Mr. Sketchy. On getting to her stop she stepped off the bus and her regular escort, the police officer, was nowhere to be seen. To make matters worse, Mr. Unsure jumps up and gets off the bus at the last minute. He walks off in the opposite direction from her but keeps looking over his shoulder at her as he does so. The bus pulls away and in the middle of the road is a huge black dog. A bit freaked out by everything, she starts off for home at a fast pace. The dog follows at a distance of about 20 feet, freaking her out even more. She turns a corner, to the section of her journey that takes her past the fenced in the garden. As she approaches the open gate the dog sprints for her. And stops about 2 feet from where she is. It then starts growling and barking, hackles up, going mentally towards the direction of the garden. This understandably is the final straw. She sprints for home and the dog stops its barking and runs after, but keeping a distance of a few feet the entire time. It's not like it can't catch her, it easily could but doesn't seem to want to. When she gets to her building it stops and just watches her go inside. She told my grandma the minute she got into their flat and he looked out the window, no dog on the street, nothing. The next day my grandparents found out that the friendly local police officer had died the day before of a heart attack. And few days later they were reporting a young woman had been attacked a few streets away from my grandmother's route home on that night around 1 a.m. My 2 sons were born when their great-grandmother was alive, but unfortunately she never got to meet either one. My husband's grandma went in for surgery and ending up contracting a raging infection from the hospital that killed her 6 weeks after they were born. She was a great lady, married 60+ years to a sweet man who was the love of her life. He passed 4 years prior, loved my husband to pieces and was very invested in my pregnancy. I was incredibly sad that my boys never got to meet their Gigi. Fast forward a year or so. My sons are 20 months old and just starting to talk. We're driving down a road and out of nowhere one son starts babbling Bobby. Dee-Dee. Bobby. Dee-Dee. We asked him who they were, but of course got no reply. We start joking about him being haunted. This goes on, every so often little man starts talking about Bobby and Dee-Dee. Then we went to my mother-in-law's house. Little man toddles up to her fridge and peers at a picture of her parents she has hanging there. Bobby. Dee-Dee. It wasn't so much creepy as it was heartwarming, honestly. Especially that night as we ate at their favorite pizza parlor, and little man looked up and announced, Bobby happy. When I was younger I was told to say a prayer in my head before I go to sleep. It was just a thing I did which I don't do anymore. I would have been 13 or 14 around the time, when the Pope died. Though I didn't know his name, I just knew that some Pope had died that day and that I should probably make a prayer for him. I remember being really tired and lying in my bed, thinking, please bless my family and my friends. Yada yada, and please take care of the Pope. I paused at that moment realizing I didn't know his name. When I heard the words clear as day, Pope John Paul. I sat up immediately and looked around the room, so frightened. It was an old man's voice. Next morning when I woke up, I went downstairs and saw the newspaper on the table with the big headline, R.I.P. Pope John Paul. Absolutely freaked out and told my parents. Thinking back, I don't really believe in the supernatural, I think everything can be explained. But this, I really don't know what happened. My parents were night cleaners for a keg restaurant in Toronto. As sometimes they needed extra help they brought along my uncle who would normally have just babysat me. I was 10 years old. He also brought over his GF, who I would mainly just hang out with while the rest of them went to work. One night, my uncle's GF and I were playing cards in one of the booths and fell asleep. Well, we were woken up my uncle screaming telling us we have to go to the basement and hurry to follow him. We both wake up and start following him, but I seem to be extremely far ahead. When I turn the corner, I bump into my uncle and ask where the basement is and what's the emergency. He responded by telling me was following my mother and father, who yelled at him from across the room to get to the basement. Standing there puzzled, we caught up to my uncle's GF who had bumped into my parents. They said that they heard mine and my uncle's GF voice from the basement and my father had gone to get the spare keys because it was locked. It seemed like something was trying to lure us into the basement. The first time I had sleep paralysis was over 3 years ago while attempting to lucid dream. I panicked and it scared me but nothing like that happened again, so I let it go. Fast forward to the last few weeks. I had a nightmare that a door was in my cellar that doesn't actually exist. I was strapped in a chair and couldn't move, and this door opened, and I felt something purely evil on the other side and it kept whispering my name over and over again as it came through the door. I couldn't see anything coming through, but I knew it was right by my face when I finally woke up. 2 weeks ago, I was taking a nap when I woke up and realized I couldn't move. The DIV was on, and my dog was rolling on the floor, and I could see everything except the corner of the living room. I instantly had the feeling there was that same evil presence and it was whispering my name repeatedly as it got closer to me. Suddenly the evil went away, and it felt like I floated out of my body, and I snapped back down onto the couch and woke up. The next night I actually saw the evil thing in my room during another sleep paralysis episode. I woke up and couldn't move, and this dark figure was at the end of my bed just staring this time, and I kept saying that I wasn't scared, it's not real, when suddenly it whispered that it knew I was scared. I freaked out and held my breath until I woke up. The next couple of days I had a few more episodes, but nothing too visually horrifying, just a sense of pure evil in the room and a fear so deep in my being that I can't even begin to explain it. Last night it all came to a head. I was staying at my dad's friend's cabin out in the middle of nowhere. I was on the pull-out couch by myself in the sitting room. In the middle of the night, I woke up and he was standing at the side of my bed staring at me. Somehow he was immediately lying next to me, staring me in the eyes. His face was goblin-like but also extremely hard to picture from memory. He had a long nose. His eyes were empty. They were glossy eyeballs, but they were pure blackness that seemed more like holes. I was absolutely angry and started yelling, thinking, "You're not real, go away, you are not real," and it started telling me that it was in fact very real and that I should be terrified. I don't remember exactly how, but I woke myself up and realized I was shaking and whimpering like a puppy that just got kicked repeatedly. I also had tears streaming down my face, even though I don't remember starting to cry during the encounter. I used to work at Phillips, up near Sleepy Hollow in New York. During my lunch breaks, I liked to wander through the forest on the work property. One beautiful October day, I was admiring the autumn leaves when I saw a dollar standing in front of me. There's a word, numinous, for feeling in the presence of something spiritual, something unworldly. That's how I felt. I quietly and carefully stepped closer to get a better view. I was able to approach quite close, almost close enough to touch him. At that moment, though, the deer turned, and I felt all the hair on my arms rise. The deer's eyes were red and dripping with blood. It must have had some disease that had blinded it, and its blindness allowed me to get so close. In the moment, though, it was terrifying and uncanny. My mom is Native American. She named my sister Chula, which means fox. Most likely because of her name Sake, but maybe not. My sister loved everything that had to do with a fox. Last November my mom was doing dishes at the sink and looking out the window at the woods like she always does. Well, she looks up from the dishes to the edge of the woods, and at that moment a fox steps out of the woods. It sits on its hind legs and stares right at my mom's face while she stares back through the window. She said it seemed like 5 minutes they stared at each other. Suddenly the fox got up, turned around and slowly walked into the woods. My mom said her first thought was to call Chula to tell her about the fox. My sister never answered. She died in a head-on collision that day due to some drunk driver. My mom keeps looking for the fox. It has never come back. Some years back, I was at university with a friend I'd known from school. We weren't best friends, but good mates. We knew about each other and got on well enough. I knew that he was a spiritualist, and he'd sometimes talk about his spiritual guide and whatnot. Not really what I believe in, but each to their own. Anyway, we were both hanging around the halls of residence where I lived. He lived in another halls, wasting time and watching crap on the tiny TV in the shared kitchen. We were waiting until 2 a.m. as that's when WWE, or WWF, as it was called then, would be showing. As we didn't have Sky, cable, for our American friends, we would often wait up in the halls, then walk down to the local 24-hour snooker/pool hall, which would show Sky Sports. Usually, you could ask them to stick the wrestling on and turn the volume up. Anyway, we're chatting a lot of rubbish and just watching stupid stuff on the TV. Can't remember what we were talking about, but I remember after that it wasn't anything creepy. We hadn't been drinking or anything like that either, we were completely sober. We're chatting away when we realize we need to get going down to the pool hall if we want to catch the wrestling. So, we stick on our coats and continue our conversation as we walk outside. Now, it's weird, the moment I walk through the door, I feel cold. It's 2 a.m. in England sometime in the spring, so it wasn't going to be warm out, but I mean, it's like I had chills running up and down my spine. Cliché, maybe, but the best way I can describe it is the slow feeling of creeping dread you get when you're watching some scary movie and the ominous music starts to play. I try and shrug it off, but it's like the dread was increasing with each step down the street. The air actually felt heavy, like it was difficult to breathe. I know that sounds like any other creepypasta story, but it's the only way I really know how to describe that horrible feeling in my gut. A minute out of the door, I suddenly realized that we're both silent. We were chatting and laughing as we left the halls, but our conversation had just faded out. I remember looking down the street, thinking that perhaps this was me being nervous about any dodgy characters nearby, but the road was clear. It was a clear night, nothing out of the ordinary at all, but to me there was this massive alarm going off in my head. I was terrified of something, and I didn't know what. Noticing the silence finally, I simply said, air feels a little thick tonight. My throat was dry by this point. He looked at me with a pale face and said, "Oh God, you can feel it too." We managed to hold a halting conversation about what it could be, but it was difficult as we both felt sick to our stomachs. Finally, as we crossed the road, I remember my friend turning even more white and saying, "It's death. Death is here." I don't really remember much after we crossed the road. Weirdly, the strange feeling suddenly subsided and we both laughed it off, even though we'd both felt it. We made it to the pool hall, and I didn't think much about it for a few days. It wasn't until later in the week that I was walking from uni, without my friend, and I passed a building close to the halls, on the road we'd crossed over where my friend had felt death. There were 3 police cars and an ambulance there. I remember watching with horror as a pair of coroners were removing a body wrapped up in black. We looked it up in the local paper the next day. Apparently, 3 homeless people had died together in the building after seeking shelter, and they'd been dead for a few days before being discovered and removed. Never did find out what they died of. I didn't go and watch much wrestling after that. I work the evening shift at a hospital that is believed to be, at least by 90% of the staff, haunted. I'm part of the 90%. You see, there have been horror stories about every building, floor, and pretty much every part of the campus. I mostly wander around alone, housekeeper, and that makes it that much worse, at least when my mind is on it. Usually I don't think about it. My personal experience was back in the ultrasound wing of the radiology clinic. By the time I get around to that area, the lights automatically dim and there isn't anything I can do about it. It's always spooky back there at night, so I usually just get done with what I need to and move on. The place is kind of shaped like a J, like a long hallway that curves around. On the inner side of the curve there's a dressing room that opens up to a mammography suite, and then opens again to the top of the J. If you're standing at the bottom of the J, you can see through the doors of both rooms to the top of the J. I was standing back there, tying a bag on my cart, when something moved in the corner of my eye. I looked up and through the dressing and mammo rooms to the other doorway opposite me. Vividly, I remember it like it was today. A male figure walks past the door, right before my eyes. I literally watched it amble slowly across my field of vision. There are no male ultrasound techs here, and it was not my boss. It looked like it was wearing dark clothing, and had long hair, but it was definitely male. I snapped out of it and ran over to see if some freak had wandered in, but no one was there. I grabbed my stuff and ran out without finishing all the work. Because screw that. Another story, not my personal experience, comes from the second floor of the hospital. The second floor has nothing but offices and computer labs, all adjacent to one corridor that spans the entire length of the building. At one end is a set of elevators, and the other are a pair of double doors that open into a computer lab. This floor is infamous for being the domain of something the workers affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard about her was from a coworker who knew someone that worked on that floor. He came in for whatever reason, doing office stuff, and was going home late one night. He walks out of the office and starts toward the elevators when something catches his eye, so he turns toward the computer lab. At the end of the hallway there's what looks like a patient peeking into the lab. He walks towards her and asks who she is and what floor she came from. She turns around. She has no face. Office guy is frozen in place, scared. He wants to run away, but he doesn't want to turn his attention away from whoever, or whatever, is staring at him down from the other end of the hall. What does he do instead? He closes his eyes as tight as he can. After several seconds, minutes, or however long it really was, he opens them, and she's gone. He says he's never ran as fast in his life as he did that night, straight outside without ever looking back. Another, Matilda, happening was when one of the managers left a tape recorder going in his office, also on the second floor, because he wanted to see if he could catch any weird noises or voices. The next day, I'm walking by his office with a coworker, and he calls us in there and plays the recording, to see if we hear it, too. After forever with nothing, a faint voice comes in and says, "Turn it off." That was spooky as hell. There are a lot more stories than that about the hospital from hell, but that's all I got time for right now. More than willing to share more later. Man, I always get to threads after their moment has passed. Anyway, I figured I would share. I do a lot of solo backpacking in western North Carolina. Usually Pisgah or Nantahala, but I've been all around. I have quite a few stories, most of them aren't really paranormal, but are definitely creepy, especially alone. About 2 years ago I was on a 4-day solo trip to Cold Mountain in Shining Rock Wilderness. I came up through Art Loeb Trail but got to my put-in later than I had planned. It was immediately clear there was no way I'd make it to my planned site before pitching black and I needed to make camp ASAP. While walking through a rhododendron and high-growth tunnel known as the Narrows, I get the unmistakable feeling that something is definitely stalking me. The dim light keeps fading and I finally find a low-lying, swampy area to camp, after passing a couple of claimed spots. I fire up my Snow Peak stove, cook, eat, smoke a bowl, and bare bag what I needed to. It's completely pitch black at this time and the feeling of being watched is so strong that it's making my head buzz. I chalk it up to the bud, laugh it off, and get in my small tent. I lay perfectly still, enjoying the height and listening to the ambient sounds when, suddenly, I feel something reach under the base of my tent near my head on the left side and brush my cheek. I immediately jump 2 feet off the ground and rip my sleeping bag off. I sit there motionless for maybe 5 minutes holding my knife and trying to figure out what just happened. I convince myself it's a mouse/rat/whatever and lay back down. Finally, I'm drifting off and all is good, when I hear, sense, really, 3 or 4 somethings walking around my site. I quietly get my knife back out and prepare for the worst, when I feel something reach under the tent again. Then again. Then 2 at the same time on opposite sides. Then 3. I finally break my silence and shout "Hey! Get!" but they keep pawing and reaching. At this point I'm pretty certain I'm dealing with coyotes. Even though they're usually pretty timid and are mostly scavengers, they were coming at me hard. I hear growling and whimpering, and I start smacking their paws with my boot as they keep digging under my tent and yelping. This goes on for about 6 or 7 long minutes as I keep shouting and playing midnight whack-a-mole. They seem to be getting more aggressive and I'm fearing for my life a little, when out of nowhere I hear a dog barking and growling in the distance and getting closer. The pawing and scratching stops and I hear the 3 or 4 coyotes snarling in the same direction near where I heard the dog. The dog keeps barking and they keep snarling and then I hear a scuffle and some of the most god-awful animal noises I've ever heard. Then silence. Complete silence that's even louder than the animal noises. Needless to say, I don't sleep a wink, and when morning comes I go out to investigate to find my tent fly ripped and spots of blood all over my campsite. I'm definitely shaken but I break camp and continue up towards the summit. About an hour in, I ran across a group of 20-somethings searching frantically for a dog. Apparently she disappeared from their sight in the middle of the night, and they'd been looking for her since morning. They ask me if I've seen her, a German shepherd, and I recount my story from the night before. We all kind of knowingly mull over the possibilities, and I promise to keep an eye out. I never saw the dog. Didn't see them again for the rest of the trip either. I really hope they found her and she's okay, but all I know is she may very well have saved my life. I have some more if anyone is interested, but for now my thumbs are cramping from mobile. Many years ago, I met up with a girl I knew from high school. I'll call her Sandy. She was more of an acquaintance back then, and we were never intimate. Even though we hung around with diverse groups of friends, I remember she once invited me to a party at her house, but nothing ever evolved past that. In fact, I met my high school girlfriend Andrea at that party. It had been several years since graduation, and I met her on the street. We chatted a bit, and to make a long story short, I ended up at her place later that night. Following a glass or two of wine, we ended up having fun on a bed in the living room. Nothing extraordinary, but it was okay. After a few minutes, she got out of the bed and shuffled to the kitchen, which was located at the far end of the living room. I was still in bed but glanced over in a groggy post-coitus haze. She entered the kitchen and flipped on the light. This is where things started to get weird. First of all, the kitchen light must have been an old ceiling fixture with those long fluorescent tubes. It kicked on with a loud groan like an old arc welder. The light that came blasting out the kitchen was a god-awful wavelength of intense radiation that bleached everything in its path. While the rest of the living room was still dark, the doorway of the kitchen had this weird glow, and the noise from the fixture didn't help matters any. This brought me to my senses somewhat, but as time passed, an intuition that something is wrong hit me. At first I thought I heard a hushed conversation in the kitchen. I didn't know if Sandy had a roommate, so being back naked, I instantly grabbed my clothes. Another minute had passed, and because there were no footsteps or the usual awkward peek around the corner, I figured she must have been on the telephone. The hushed conversation in the kitchen started growing louder, and it sounded like Sandy was having a tight-lipped argument with someone on the phone. This made me rather uncomfortable, so I got out of bed and stealthily started putting on my clothes. Now roughly 5 minutes had passed. I was dressed. I sat on the side of the bed trying to listen in and figure out what was going on. My phone theory disappeared when I thought I heard two enraged voices. The problem was that they were unmistakably coming from Sandy. I started thinking about bailing for the front door. Then the kitchen meltdown took a drastic turn as I heard sounds of a cutlery drawer being slammed open. Panic set in with the unmistakable clanging sound of metal on metal. I started scanning the dark living room for a weapon, and then all grew instantly quiet. The light went out, but not without making a final groan before darkness. I followed the sound of footsteps out of the kitchen and across the living room. I froze. While Sandy walked up to me with a smile on her face, I was looking at her hands. Even though they were empty, I was shitting bricks. Her voice reverted back to the calm and sweet, and she asked, "Do you really have to go?" I lied and told her I got dressed because she sounded busy. I really didn't know what else to say to her. I noped it out of there as best I could under the circumstances. Never heard from her again. A few months later I met another female classmate. Curious, I told her that I bumped into Sandy not too long ago. She said, "Oh, poor Sandy. I heard that she was released a while back." WTF, so I uttered an, "Oh really?" She was institutionalized shortly after high school, complete breakdown. I tried creating distance by saying we were only acquaintances, and I remembered her from that party at her house. Oh, that party. I'm not sure if anyone ever told you this, but she had planned that party for months in advance to try and snare you. Unfortunately, Andrea beat her to it. 2 minutes later edit, thank God for Facebook. Married in a faraway state. No class reunions for me though, ever. One day later, second edit, Sandy ended up fine. Recently went back to school and has a professional position. Good for her. Class reunion is still out of the question though.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.